I stand. So, after
This weird new tool is quickly becoming the most.
Answers. I present Kevin Boatright.
Well, there may be questions, whether they're answers, I can't always guarantee, but I thank you for all of that, Randy. You know, I think I mention all of that background not because it gives me any privilege here, but it just says I have been through the mill. I have experienced the church at several levels. I felt fortunate to have that experience over the years, and it continues actually to this day. So I call this a personal perspective, but the big question, what is the ELCA, otherwise known as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America? And those of us who are members of Trinity are automatically, if you will, members of the ELCA. So this is going to be what is the ELCA, but also, in a sense, who is the ELCA? And some questions will come up, I think. Some of them I will try to answer. You might say, well, where did this thing come from? Was there suddenly something called the ELCA? And many of you who are older than I am, perhaps, will totally understand that it didn't just happen that way or quite so easily, perhaps. And then what does the ELCA look like? And that can be both the structure, sort of the corporate existence, but I think more to the point, it's those of us in this room. What does it look like? Who is the ELCA? Now, how does it function? For many of you who are perhaps coming from another church background or who are perhaps new to any church, how does it function? What does it do as an entity that perhaps a single congregation could not do? But then questions that I would throw out to you, and you might think about that during my presentation, is how does the ELCA affect Trinity Lutheran Church in Lawrence, Kansas? Okay, good question. How does the ELCA affect you as individual members? What's the interface? What's the intersection? Because in a sense, does it matter? Now these are a little provocative questions, I understand, and but I throw them out to you as something to think about as I talk through this. Some of this may be slightly heavy, and there's a lot of facts in here. I'll try to sort of gloss over some of those things. I would say, however, that if anybody here at the conclusion says, boy, I wish I could look at that again. First of all, I think Ted is recording it. Correct, Ted? Okay. But also, if somebody wanted a copy of my PowerPoint slides, if I know your email address, I can send you a version of it. Okay? So these are just some of the questions, and you can see those are obviously photos of our congregation, but we are, in a sense, one part of a much larger church body that is located here in the United States. So, okay, beginning, I started with, this is the radical, is where do you begin? Well, what is a denomination? ELCA is a denomination, and there's lots of them. We're not alone in being a denomination in the Christian tradition. These are kind of maybe bullet points for you to think about, the things that I think about, that a denomination, whichever it is, provides a certain amount of structure and a certain amount of order. If you think about the way in which someone perhaps becomes a pastor, that's an example of order in a denomination. To become a pastor, you do this, this, and this. The denomination is sort of imposing an amount of order, and then there's a structure too. But it also, I would say more to the point, it's a community. If you're a member of the ELCA, if you go to a church in Washington, or you go to a church in Maine, or you go to Key West, I'm not sure about Key West, but maybe there's wherever you go, you're there. Wherever you go, you're there. There's an ELCA presence all over our country. And that's a community. And there's a certain amount of unity, too. Not an imposed unity. Not an ironclad, rigid unity, but in a sense, if you're in the ELCA or any denomination, you've got a certain amount of unity, of a commonality of opinion, viewpoint, perspectives. A denomination, especially the ELCA, is an avenue for service. There's ways to serve in the world, literally in the world. There's ways to engage in the church as well. Leadership and accountability, personally, I think is very important. I serve on the discipline committees, where accountability is our mission statement, frankly. But there are churches where there is no accountability, shall we say, between the person who's in the pulpit and some higher entity. In a denomination like the ELCA especially, that leadership is not only accountable to the congregation, but will be accountable to the bishop, the synod, and potentially even the church-wide body. There's a real concern that people be held accountable for their actions, their behavior, those kinds of things. Finally, into identity and brand, okay? To a significant degree, Garrison Keillor, for a generation, sort of was the Lutheran brand, usually by joking about it or making, the Lutherans of Lake Wobegon. But in a sense, there's some of that. There's an identity. We're Lutheran. Lutherans are this, that, the other thing. A certain amount of brand, if you will, in a marketing sense. I don't say that to be derogatory, but that's part of what a denomination provides. But I really love this comment, a good time to be the church. H. George Anderson was a church-wide presiding bishop some years ago, and he wrote a wonderful book, and he talks about what is a denomination. Denominations are built around great causes: foreign missions, education, home missions, the care of the aged and orphans, urgent needs that congregations could not address alone. But then, the issue for our time, a challenge to all of us, he wrote this in 1997, by the way. The issue for our time is whether Christians still feel that these or other great causes demand their loyalty or cooperation. Otherwise, all you retired pastors, the only role for denominations is to facilitate pastoral mobility and administer pension funds. I thought that was a really excellent statement of why does it matter? And here's part of why it matters. Let's say loyalty, the terminology of loyalty. We'll talk a bit here about the Christianity in America. And the numbers don't really look so great because it's hard to read that chart, but it's basically saying if switching continues at most recent rates, Christians would lose their majority by 2060, but in 2070 would still be the largest religious group. What you see is a track on the top of the percentage of Americans who identify with a Christian tradition, and it's gone from about 85% 30 years ago to now it's about 63%. But the United States is the world's largest population, has the world's largest population of Christians. They're everywhere. 140 million Protestants, 70 million Catholics. We're also the world's largest Protestant population, but the line on the bottom there in that chart is all others. The second line is sort of religiously unaffiliated, but the Muslims, others, there's more Muslims than there are ELCA Lutherans, by the way, in the United States. But I love this because, Paul in the book of Acts says, men of Athens, I see, you are very religious in all respects. We even have it on our money, okay? Although you sometimes wonder if we are so religious, if we are the most Christian nation in the world, why do we have camps in East Lawrence? Why do we have shelters, etc.? Why do we have any shortage of support for those kinds of things? That's an editorial comment. If you want to know about our ranking, this isn't KU basketball, but if you look at Protestant Christianity in America, these 12 denominations, if you will, and actually conglomerations of denominations, Lutherans are number 5. We're number 5. That includes all Lutherans. That's Missouri Synod Lutherans, Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, North American Lutherans, etc. But give you a sense, where do we sit? Well, Baptists, non-denominational, Methodists, all of those. We're right up at the top. Now, we speak sometimes about mainline Protestant Christianity, and these are considered, they were once referred to as the Seven Sisters. I don't know why, but these are sort of the largest, what they call mainline Protestant Christianity. And in a sense, these are typically church bodies that came to this country from somewhere else. They immigrated and took their church with them to America. And the fine print is kind of interesting because mainline churches tend to belong to organizations such as the National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, and by the way, for the Stewardship Committee, we have the highest number of graduate and postgraduate degrees per capita of any Christian denomination in the U.S., as well as the most high-income earners. How's that for a thought? So if you're in this category of mainline, wow, Stewardship Committee. Right, okay, but weekly attendance now, okay, we're the most Christian nation, but you look at, and by the way, a lot of the statistics in here are grabbed as I could grab them from several sources. There is no such thing as the U.S. Census Bureau that has perfect information, but in general, these are going to be correct. Is where do people go to church every week? Well, the most are in Utah, but even there, about only half of all those folks in Utah. National average, Kansas. The least church going is the state of Vermont, but compare that to, some of our brethren in some other countries. These are the estimates that you see. Is people are members, yeah, they affiliate with, they consider themselves to be, but any of you who've ever been to Europe and gone to church in Europe, you probably have seen great big churches with not a whole lot of people in them. So this is, again, part of this description of Christianity in America, Protestant, of which we are a part, and a big part, an important part. So, ELCA, where did we come from? And I'll say theologically, where did we come from? And I don't want to get into a discussion of the small call articles or some of the other things that we could discuss, but where did we come from? Well, you all know we're a Reformation church. We are the ultimate Reformation church. We are the original Reformation church. If you think of what some scholars, call a Martin Luther event, okay? Knocking on the door of the church with a hammer and his 95 theses for debate. That's the event. That was a turning point in world history. But the ELCA, today, if you look at their website especially, you'll see what is the basis of our theology? Well, it won't surprise you, the canonical scriptures, the ecumenical creeds, and can someone name the third? The Athanasian Creed. Yes, Nicene, Apostles, Athanasian. We subscribe to the Augsburg Confession, which was written in the 1520s, as I recall, and is in fact a pretty good description of what it means to be a Lutheran. The Book of Concord is something that maybe not everyone has cracked the cover of, but hey, it does contain what we believe in theologically, so and including, of course, the large and the small catechisms. This chart is actually a pretty good one. This is saying in the 16th century, you had sort of 4 pieces of the Western Christendom, and this chart sort of shows you what some of the differences were. And in Lutheranism, the ministers lead the congregation. Salvation is by faith alone. The Bible is the sole source of revealed truth. The worship service is focused on preaching and ritual, and believers interpret the Bible for themselves. That's still pretty much the way we are 400, 500 years later. The Anglicans actually have share some of that same thing, except in their case, Henry VIII was the head of the church, not the Pope, not congregation. But again, in the Roman Catholic tradition, it's quite different, right? The Pope is the head of the church, and there are other things too. So you might just contemplate this a little bit, because this is in fact kind of where we're at in the West, not in the East with the Orthodox churches. And we tend to think in terms of 5 statements that are shorthand, and maybe some of us memorize this in catechism class. What we believe is Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, and glory to God alone. And notice the solos. So I said at the beginning that this is mine alone. Well, it's like o solo mia. O solo. What I'm saying is mine alone. Okay. But are there 5 Latin phrases that every Lutheran should know? Please don't hold me to it. Where do we come from geographically? Well, we're a European church, and we carry all that baggage. Okay, we carry all that baggage. But our origins are in the Holy Roman Empire. In 1517, Wittenberg in the country of Saxony, you had Luther. We expanded north into Scandinavia. Other churches splintered off. The Roman Catholics had a counter-reformation. All of that we're familiar with. So we're definitely a European church, but for our purposes, for the ELCA's purposes, we're an immigrant church. That's actually a pretty good representation of somebody leaving Sweden in the 1850s, coming to America because the farms were dying out in Sweden, and all the things that made you want to leave Sweden, or made you want to leave Germany because Prussia was constantly at war and conscripting the men to serve in the military. This is actually a still from a movie, by the way, that some of you may have seen once, The Immigrant. But we're an immigrant church. The whole 19th century migration to America, this huge journey of huge numbers of Europeans, Irish, English, Germans, Scandinavians, Italians, massive change by moving across the Atlantic Ocean to this new world. And where did those folks settle? Well, mid-Atlantic, if you think of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, the Carolinas a little bit, and also in the Great Lakes area, if you think of Wisconsin, but then into the plains, and as Lou can attest, to some extent a certain number into Texas. But only because Germans emigrated to Texas. So this, if you're going, this is the map. This is Lutherans in America and the world. The dark areas are that's a high percentage or higher than normal percentage of that county's population are Lutheran of some kind. So it doesn't surprise you, we're still where we arrived. We're in the upper Midwest, we're in the Great Lakes, we're in the New York, Pennsylvania area with these enclaves in places like Texas and North Carolina. So we're geographically still kind of stuck with what we inherited when they all came to this country in the 19th century. The Lutheran World Federation is, as some of you may know, is kind of a body of Lutheran churches in various countries, 99 different countries, about 75 million members. And if using their numbers, the most Lutherans that there are in the world are in Germany, about 11.5 million. The United States is pretty far down that list. I would point out that is only the ELCA. There are no other Lutheran bodies in America that are members of the Lutheran World Federation. But we're behind Norway and ahead of Nigeria, so we're back to rankings again. But you see, these are more colonial vestiges, if you will, of where the church began Lutheran traditions in Europe. Ethiopia, Tanzania, Indonesia, India are all ahead of us. Nigeria, Papua New Guinea. Those of you who remember Pastor Gary Teskey, who served for many years as a missionary in Papua New Guinea. That's because there were a lot of Lutherans there. More than 1 million. Okay. So at any rate, that gives you a sense of our background. So where we came from historically, well, 1640, and again, this is the part that you don't really need to take notes, but Sweden actually had a presence in what is now New Jersey and Delaware in the 1640s, I mean, right after the Mayflower. And in 1640, a pastor actually came over, a Lutheran pastor, with the wonderful name of Rioris Tarkulis. Okay, so if anybody ever want to name a child after a pastor, Rioris Boatright. But in reality, when we think of the Lutherans in America today, it really begins in the 1740s in Pennsylvania with Muhlenberg, and that the whole formation of a sort of a Lutheran denomination, if you will, in Pennsylvania. Here's a good, I used to say these are bar bets, where you put money on some really obscure factoid. Who was the first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives? We know it's Nancy Pelosi right now. Well, it was a pastor, Frederick A.C. Muhlenberg from Pennsylvania. He was the first U.S. Speaker of the House. The first seminary, Lutheran seminary, was at Gettysburg. You may be familiar with that. And the first college was in Columbus, Ohio. We've had a long tradition of educating people. Okay? Colleges, schools, seminaries, we're big on that. When you're a denomination that is really traces its roots to somebody who was a university professor, Martin Luther, well, that's a tradition. That's a good tradition. And any of you who have ever visited the famous battlefield has probably seen Schmucker Hall. How's that for a name? Schmucker Hall at Gettysburg, which is now part of the United Lutheran Seminary of the ELCA. It's still there. Wonderful museum. But this is starting to bring us now to the general topic for today, is where did we come from as a denomination? And it is complex, okay? It is, to say the least, a complex thing. Because all of these groups came from all of these countries in Europe. They brought their pastors with them, they brought their languages with them, they brought their traditions with them, they brought it all with them. All that baggage was in the trunk on the boat, they brought it with them. And it became it was difficult for them to talk to each other, linguistically, or theologically, all those things. But early in the 20th century, some of those groups began to see the value of coming together. If they came together, they could do more in mission, they could do more in ministry to the world. They couldn't do that if there were going to be 27 different Lutheran denominations. So you see, in the First World War and shortly thereafter, you begin to see an amalgamation, even though there remained for many, many years Swedish, Danish, Finnish, Norwegian, Icelandic, Slovak, and Latvian related synods in this country. But in the 1960s, the merger process began in earnest, and we eventually had two significant Lutheran denominations, the American Lutheran Church and then the Lutheran Church in America. And this all happened, say, in the early 60s. I would point out that through all this process, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has chosen not to participate in this process. But in 1982, an agreement was reached, and the American Lutherans said, we will join the ELCA. We have enough in common. We share enough things. We have, in in St. Paul, we have seminaries across the street from each other, okay? They said, well, let's get together, and we can do more in mission and ministry if we're together. And so by 1988, those two denominations, plus a group of about 250 congregations in the Missouri Synod Church, came together as the ELCA. And this will simplify it for you. If that seemed complicated, I'm sorry, but this I have circled here, by the way in which my own family represents some of the history of the ELCA. I was baptized in United Lutheran Church in America. Our daughter was baptized in the LCA. Our son was baptized in the ELCA. And then there's my wife, who was baptized in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. And we also have with us, proud to say, someone who was baptized in the Scandinavian Augustana Synod, Jan Conrad. So another predecessor church body, Jan and Don, her late husband, were members. So you get a sense of this is complicated, isn't it? I mean, it's crazy. And of course, it's not over, because if you look off where it has my son's name, Clark, since the merger in 1988, at least two groups of Lutherans have decided they want to go a different direction and are no longer part of the ELCA. So this is the history we're dealing with. So let's talk now about the ELCA as a denomination. And it may be that if you're not familiar with the ELCA, if you did not grow up in this side of the Lutheran world, this is pretty much, I'm going to talk now about organization and function and those sorts of things. We talk about the ELCA as being in three expressions. Sort of like the Trinity is we talk of it as three persons, God in three persons. Well, this is kind of the church in three expressions. And one of them, and by no means the most important one, is the church-wide organization. Below that, if you will, are the synods. And I hope you all know we're a member of the Central States Synod, which extends from St. Louis to the Colorado border, okay, a very big geographical space. But then the third expression is us, congregations. And they all relate to each other, and they're all structured somewhat the same way. Church-wide organization is located in Chicago. And sometimes, actually, I've coming into O'Hare from the west, you can look out the left window and you can see the ELCA's headquarter building on West Higgins Road. And that's where it's been since the founding in 1988. What I would say is a hallmark of the ELCA is participatory governance. If you think back to the Roman Catholic tradition, for example, there ain't a lot of participatory governance, is there? Right? The decisions are made by men, the decisions are made in Rome, you know how that is. Well, in the ELCA, it's a very different world. We have a constitution and bylaws that you're welcome to read. That sort of then there's a synod congregation, and then there's a congregational constitution. They're very similar. The church-wide assembly, and that's a picture of the assembly this past summer in Columbus, Ohio. The church-wide assembly is the highest legislative authority in the ELCA. That is where you go to get things resolved at a church-wide level. But then in between church-wide assemblies, there's a council, and that council can make also those decisions. And you'll notice the same thing applies at the synod level. There's a synod assembly. There's a synod council. We have congregational annual meetings, and we have our own council. So that's how we participate. But an important point here is at all those levels, especially a church-wide assembly, a synod assemblies, 50% women, okay? And typically 50-50-ish rostered ministers to laity. In other words, there's a whole lot of transparency here, and there's a whole lot of inclusion, We also, at assemblies, try to have some younger members, speakers of other languages. It is a very conscious decision to make the participatory governance real. You can find this on the ELCA's website, but it's important to know we have a vision and mission. We're like Microsoft. We have a vision and a mission. We have goals, purposes, vision, priority areas, values. It's all there, and hopefully they're relatively easy for all of us to subscribe to. The goal is to share the story of Jesus and the ELCA by engaging with 1 million new people as we grow the church together. That's a big project. Our purpose, activate each of us so more people know the way of Jesus and discover community, justice, and love. And then the vision is a world experiencing the difference God's grace and love in Christ make for all people and creation. I think we can all agree to that, but I think we also have to agree those are tall orders, aren't they? Especially in a world that is struggling as it is today to have a better understanding of what the Christian faith is all about. But as I say, that's all available on the website. And this is a tagline. I mean, as I say, we are a little corporate, aren't we? We've got vision and mission and all that, which is good. We also have our own tagline and also logo and branding standards. There's our logo, and don't you dare modify it. But God's work, our hands. And you may have seen for the church-wide assembly this last summer, their tagline was embody the word. Okay, so we do that. We're trying to be mindful of that. I think here at Trinity, we've had some discussions already about changing our mission statement a bit here at Trinity. You may be hearing more about that as that proceeds. Leadership of the ELCA, this does not look perhaps like the College of Cardinals. ELCA church-wide is led by a woman, the first woman to serve as a presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, who was formerly a bishop in a synod in Ohio. Her predecessors had all been sort of Scandinavian related, okay? Herb Kjellstrom, H. George Anderson, okay? So Elizabeth Eaton is a somewhat different person and really a wonderful leader for our church. Now in her 9th year, so she has 3 more years of her term. The vice president is a lay person. And this is another thing that's rather unique, I think, about the ELCA is yes, an ordained person must be the bishop of the church, but the vice president is the person who runs the church-wide assemblies and chairs the church-wide council. And Imam Siddiqui was born Muslim. He became a Lutheran about 20 years ago. He lives in Atlanta. He's a lawyer, he was in Atlanta. He now lives, I think, in Washington, D.C., because he's an attorney for the U.S. government. Kind of an interesting background, right? But he was elected this last summer as our vice president, a layperson. And then the secretary is someone who some of you may know or may have met, Sue Rothmeyer, had a background in campus ministry. She's been in this room a few times for events here at Trinity. At any rate, Sue Rothmeyer. But then at the synod level, now at the Central State Synod, I'm sure you've seen both of these people, I think. Bishop Candia was here when Pastor Jeff was installed as pastor. Her associate is Dave Wetter, and some of you may recall, he was elected, he was vicar here at one point with Gary Teskey. In other words, while he was in seminary, he spent a year, and in fact, in his case, a little longer than a year, sort of in training at this congregation. And then again, at the synod level, the vice president, the person who presides at the assemblies, is also a layperson, Nancy Nagel. So that's kind of an interesting thing in comparison to maybe some other church bodies, is there's a whole lot of lay involvement, laypersons, all of us here who are not ordained or rostered people, can have a big involvement in it. And I'll throw out some facts and figures, and again, don't stress over these, but and they change probably from Sunday to Sunday, because there's no hard and fast numbers that you can necessarily look to on a daily basis, but probably 3.1 to 3.3 million baptized members. In the ELCA, a little under 9,000 congregations, 65 synods, of which were one. I've thrown out the word rostered leader. Not everybody uses that, but that's basically anybody who's an ordained pastor is in the roster. I think even when you're on leave from call, I don't know if I'm retired from call, you remain on the roster. You're on the roster, but that also includes associates in ministry, other people who are in service of some kind of the church at a certain level. They're also on the roster. Of our clergy, roughly a third are women. Okay, and we've had women as ordained clergy in the ELCA and its predecessor church bodies for more than 50 years. Okay. And about half of current seminarians are women. So, important distinction for us. We remain involved in education, 26 colleges and universities, and I put this in here for Ryan's benefit. We have the Bethany College Swedes, the Seeds of Lindsborg. It's just one example of a Lutheran-related college. In my experience, I remember Midland in Nebraska, Luther in Wartburg, in Iowa, Carthage in Wisconsin. It's a 26.
In Illinois.
And, lest I forget, Augustana in Rock Island, Illinois, formerly affiliated with the Scandinavian Augustana Church. Campus ministries are all part of this, roughly 180 that have some kind of direct support, but there's lots of campuses where there's a ministry that is affiliated very closely with the local congregation, and they maybe share a pastor. A church-wide budget, which isn't actually that big when you think it's $69 million. That's our church-wide budget. But in addition, there's about $23 million beyond that support what's known as Lutheran World Hunger, a major initiative that goes really all over the country. That picture on the lower left, the Lutheran Church of Hope in West Des Moines, is reportedly the largest ELCA congregation in the country. It is both this giant amphitheater type church, but they also have some other locations, satellites, and they reputedly have more than 10,000 members.
Where is that?
Headquartered in West Des Moines, Iowa. Anyway, so who is the ELCA? 96% white, 56% female, 31% age 65 and over, 62% married, 36% college or post-college grad. Household income stewardship committee, 26% have household income of 100,000 or more. Now, these are all come from something that the Pew Research Group did a survey. This is almost 10 years old now, but it's still interesting. Politically, in terms of our viewpoints from the same survey, we're basically like the country, half and half Democrat, Republican. An amazing half and half. Government aid to the poor does more harm than good, or does more good than harm. Okay, there you go. They'd like more Lutherans, ostensibly, would like to see stricter environmental laws. Okay, interesting. Some other viewpoints, though, of interest. According to the survey, homosexuality should be accepted. Strongly favor same-sex marriage. There's a reason in which the mainline churches are sometimes positively or negatively described as liberal. Well, yeah, if you ask them in surveys, what do they say? What do they think? Okay. And 20% say Scripture is the Word of God and should be taken literally. It's not a very big number, but we've also been trained in this faith to ask, what does this mean? You know, if you think of Luther, he's in the Catechism, what does this mean? Well, we've been trained to ask, what does this mean? And that can mean, you know, challenging, you know, the literal nature of the canonical Scriptures. 67% believe in God, absolutely certain. Another 28 are kind of honky Christians, fairly certain. A lot of people say it's religion's important in one's life, and yet 35% attend a religious service. Those make you wonder. It's just a simple reference here now to some of the organizations or services that you might come across in the ELCA. I would strongly recommend, if you don't already receive a magazine once a month called Living Lutheran. This is produced by the ELCA. It's part of that community that I was talking about, a certain amount of community and unity. I think we've all heard recently about something called the Mission Investment Fund, because the congregation has voted to seek a loan from the Mission Investment Fund to help us as we begin our work on the tuck pointing for the house, for the church rather. There is an ELCA foundation which receives gifts, and you can have them in your estate plan, and just the same as you would anything else. Very large organization. But there's a press, the Augsburg Fortress Press. The women of the ELCA, I think all of us are familiar with that, with ELCA. And it has a wonderful magazine also called Gather that I'd recommend. But there are Lutheran services in America, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Lutheran World Relief. Some of these in concert with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We actually do, as a denomination, have some involvement with them. But I just should point out that ELCA is not Thrivent. As I look at our banner over here, Thrivent was originally the Aid Association for Lutherans and Lutheran Brotherhood, okay? Now it's Thrivent, and it's a wonderful entity, but it ain't ELCA. It's really for anybody. Lutheran Volunteer Corps is a wonderful organization, but it's not ELCA. And anybody who's ever bought a coffee mug that said, Lutherans are sweet Swedes, or words to that effect, Old Lutheran sells t-shirts, mugs, and you name it. Nope, not part of the ELCA. But we have a lot of relationships. And this is another distinguishing feature of our church, is, you know, if we can find commonality, we're gonna join you. We're gonna ask you to join with us as, you know, partners. We don't merge with these other entities, but we certainly want you as our partners. World Council of Churches, National Council of Churches, Lutheran World Federation. But then, over the years, we've adopted full communion relationships with these 6 denominations in the United States. It hasn't been without controversy. I was actually at the Church-wide Assembly when we voted to have a common agreement with the Episcopal Church. There were lots of people who said, I can't deal with that. United Methodist Church, Presbyterians, all of these. Well, part of what this means is you can go to their church and take communion, but also a pastor in the ELCA could take a call at one of these other churches. Could, and vice versa. And we're also hoping that you have ministry relationships, and a good example locally is Lutheran Campus Ministry at Westwood House is ELCA and the Synod, but it's also United Methodist Church. So there's a connection there that we welcome, and the ELCA works long and hard on these kinds of developing these relationships based on us having more in common than we have not in common, okay? We have more in common, we're open to these kinds of relationships.
Isn't Lutheran World Relief is one of those organizations?
Yes, that's right. So another way in which we are an unusual church body is social statements. A social statement is defined as a teaching and a policy document. It is not the same as a creed or dogma. The Augsburg Confession is nothing like that. Teaching and policy documents, they involve a huge amount of participation and deliberation, ultimately involve a 2/3 vote at a church-wide assembly. And they set a policy, but it's mostly used so that the bishop, when she or he speaks to the world, can speak with some authority about a social topic, okay? Not a theological topic, but a social topic. And there are even also social messages, social resolutions. Here's a list, and it's on it's on the ELCA's website. Beginning with a socialist statement, 1991, on abortion, but there's been others on the death penalty, on sort of the creation of the world, and taking care of our world. This is an example of what one looks like: sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all. And but then we had them on education, on human sexuality, which again proved to be very controversial. But these sort of well up as memorials to the churchwide assembly. Synod assemblies say, we'd like the churchwide body to do this. And there's one right now that's in progress on the church, state, and civic participation. So it's going to sort of be, what is our role as citizens in this country? And that will be acted upon in 3 years at the next synod, at the next churchwide assembly. But these are interesting reading. You know, if you want to know a little bit more about what we say we believe. But there's also been a discussion recently about revisiting the abortion social statement in the aftermath of the Roe v. Wade decision. So it's possible to go back and say, well, that was 30 years ago, now what do we think? That may happen. But they're interesting reading. And in fact, also from the churchwide assembly this last summer, okay, what lies ahead for our denomination? And this came as a memorial, a set of memorials, and there's going to be a commission for a renewed Lutheran church to reconsider the statements of purpose, all matters pertaining thereto. And the plan is that at the churchwide assembly in 2025, there's going to come a report. And that report may lead to a reconstituting convention of the ELCA. So we may be seeing some interesting times as this process begins to move ahead. But I'd also ask you, before we obsess too much about our structure and our way of doing this, what lies ahead for the church is equally a concern, I think. Great story yesterday on National Public Radio, and I saw it and I put it in here, about as attendance dips, churches change to stay relevant for a new wave of worshipers. So it's thought-provoking. And for example, this one pastor says he left the church, he was a pastor, because traditional church was not connecting with people. He felt they were turned off by the sermons. Sorry, pastor. The pitches for money, yeah. The Sunday morning formality, yeah. All those things. So we have an issue. And because I say liberal mainline Protestants are hemorrhaging members. Well, hemorrhaging may be slightly strong, but maybe not. And they mention a church in Knoxville where the stained glass windows are still there, but today the structure houses an architectural firm and a Golden Roast coffee shop. Yeah. And then this was kind of an interesting quote too. This is a graduate student in English at the University of Tennessee who says she's a refugee from fundamentalist churches. Yeah, there's a few of them. I want time to sit down like we do on Sundays sometimes. We're around the fire and like pray and recenter and figure out what we're about in the world, because the world is very noisy. And then I want a church to get stuff stuff done with your community and for your community. And that last sentence kind of resonated, for me at least, with our recent capital campaign. Now, that probably wouldn't be our mission statement, not the way she described it, but it's essentially the same. Get stuff done with your community and for your community. It's all very useful. There's endless additional resources, of course, about the ELCA. The website is a great source of everything, about our teachings, about the social statements. You name it, it's there. Lovely book from Augsburg Fortress in 1994, The Introduction to Lutheranism. Two books about the merger process, which may be heavy reading for most, but very useful and very interesting. And then recently, we were actually, I think, going to have a conversation here at Trinity based around Catherine Roloff's book, Grace Alone, Lutheran. I'm not sure that happened, but there was some discussion of doing that. At any rate, any of those books would be useful and provocative, but this one is non-canonical.
Oh,
As I say, non-canonical, not official, not ELCA. And this is a great quote, because I do believe these Lutherans are the sort of people you could call up when you're in deep distress. If you're dying, they'll comfort you. If you're lonely, they'll talk to you. And if you're hungry, they'll give you tuna. So that's part of it. For better or worse, that is part of our identity. It's not a bad identity to have, but it's part of it. So that kind of concludes my personal perspective on the ELCA, and where it came from, what it is, a little bit about where it's going. And I hope that's been useful to all of you today. So if there's some questions.